On this day in history, December 27th, 1831, Charles Darwin embarks on his journey aboard HMS Beagle, during which he will begin to formulate his theory of evolution. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the naturalist. Charles Robert Darwin, born 1809, died 1882. English naturalist, author of The Origin of Species, was born at Shrewsbury on February 12, 1809, the grandson of Dr. Erasmus Darwin. His mother, a daughter of Josiah Wedgwood, 1730 to 1795, died in 1817. Charles's elder brother, Erasmus Alvey, 1804 to 81, was interested in literature and art rather than science. On the subject of the wide difference between the brothers, Charles wrote that he was inclined to agree with Francis Galton in believing that education and environment produce only a small effect on the mind of anyone, and that most of our qualities are innate. Life and Letters, London, 1887. Darwin considered that his own success was chiefly due to the love of science, unbounded patience in long reflecting over any subject, industry in observing and collecting facts, and a fair share of invention as well as of common sense. He also says, "I have steadily endeavored to keep my mind free so as to give up any hypothesis, however much beloved, and I cannot resist forming one on every subject, as soon as facts are shown to be opposed to it." The essential causes of his success are to be found in this latter sentence. The creative genius ever inspired by existing knowledge to build hypotheses, by whose aid further knowledge could be won. The calm, unbiased mind, the love of truth, which enabled him to abandon or to modify his own creations when they ceased to be supported by observation. The great naturalist appeared in the ripeness of time, when the world was ready for his splendid generalizations. In the preparation for Darwin, Sir Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology played an important part, accustoming men's mind to the vast changes brought by natural processes, and leading them, by its lucid and temperate discussion of Lamarck's and other views, to reflect upon evolution. Darwin studied at Shrewsbury School under Dr. Samuel Butler, 1774 to 1839, and in 1825 went to Edinburgh to prepare for the medical profession, for which he was unfitted by nature. In 1828 his father sent him to Christ's College, Cambridge, with the idea that he should become a clergyman. He took his degree in 1831, 10th in the list of those who do not seek honors. Both at Edinburgh and at Cambridge, he gained the friendship of older scientific men, Robert Edmund Grant and William McGillivray, at the former, John Stevens Henslow and Adam Sedgwick at the latter. From December 1831 to October 1836, Darwin was on the Beagle as naturalist for the surveying expedition. After visiting the Cape de Verde and other Atlantic islands, the expedition surveyed on the South American coasts and adjacent islands, including the Galapagos. Afterwards, visiting Tahiti, New Zealand, Australia, Tasmania, Keeling Island, Maldives, Mauritius, St. Helena, Ascension, and Brazil. De Verdes and Azores on the way home. His work on the geology of these countries and that on coral islands became the subject of volumes which he published after his return, as well as his Journal of a Naturalist, and his other contributions to the official narrative. The voyage was the real preparation for his life work. His observations on the relation between animals in islands and those on the nearest continent, and between living animals and those most recently extinct and found fossil in the same country, related but not the same, led to him to reflect upon the modification of a species. He had also been much impressed by the manner in which closely allied animals replaced one another in proceeding southwards in South America. His pocketbook for 1837 contains the words, "In July opened the first notebook on transmutation of species. Had been greatly struck from about the month of previous March, while still on the voyage and just over 28 years old, on character of South American fossils and species on Galapagos archipelago. These facts, especially latter, origin of all my views." From 1838 to 1841 he was secretary of the Geological Society, and saw a great deal of Sir Charles Lyell, to whom he dedicated the second edition of his journal. In January 1839, he married his cousin, Emma Wedgwood. They lived in London until 1842, when they moved to Down, which was Darwin's home for the rest of his life. From 1846 to 1854, he was chiefly engaged upon 4 monographs on the recent and fossil cirripede Crustacea, Royal Society, 1851 to 1854, and Paleontography Society, 1851 and 1854. Soon after opening his notebook in 1837, he began to collect facts bearing upon the formation of the breeds of domestic animals and plants, and quickly saw that selection was the keystone of man's success. But how selection could be applied to organisms living in a state of nature remained for some time a mystery to him. Various ideas as to the causes of evolution had to be successively abandoned. He had the idea of laws of change which affected species and finally led to their extinction, to some extent analogous to the causes which bring about the development, maturity, and finally death of an individual. He also had the conception that species must give rise to other species or else die out, just as an individual dies unrepresented if it bears no offspring. In October 1838, he read Malthus on Population, and, his observations having long since convinced him of the struggle for existence, it at once struck him that under these circumstances favorable variations would tend to be preserved, and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. The result of this would be the formation of a new species. Here, then, I had a theory by which to work. In June 1842, he wrote out a sketch, which in 1844 he expanded to an essay of 231 pages folio. The idea of progressive divergence as an advantage in itself, because the competition is most severe against organisms most closely related, did not occur to him until long after. In January 1844, he wrote to his friend, Sir Joseph Hooker, "At last gleams of light have come, and I almost convinced, quite contrary to the opinion I started with, that species are not, it is like confessing a murder, immutable." In 1857, he explained his views to the great American botanist, Asa Gray, in a letter which afterwards became classical. He had completed about half of a third and far more expanded treatise, when, in June 1858, he received a manuscript from A.R. Wallace, who was then at Ternate in the Moluccas. Wallace wanted Darwin's opinion on the manuscript, which he had asked should be forwarded to Lyell. Darwin was much startled to find in the essay a complete abstract of his own theory of natural selection. He wrote to Lyell, "Your words have come true with a vengeance, that I should be forestalled." He placed himself in the hands of Lyell and Hooker, who decided to send Wallace's essay to the Linnean Society, together with an abstract of Darwin's work, which they asked him to prepare, the joint essay being accompanied by an explanatory letter to the secretary. The title of the joint communication was On the Tendency of Species to Form Varieties, and on the perpetuation of varieties in species by natural means of selection. It was read on July 1st, 1858, and appears in the Linnean Society Journal, Zoology, for that year. In the statement of the theory of natural selection, Darwin's part consisted of 2 sections, the first being extracts from his 1844 essay, including a brief account of sexual selections, and the second, an abstract of his letter to Asa Gray, dated September 5, 1857. Canon H.B. Tristram was the first to apply the new theory, explaining by its aid the colors of desert birds, etc. Acting under the advice of Lyell and Hooker, Darwin published on November 24, 1859, his great work, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. The whole edition of 1,250 copies was exhausted on the day of issue. The first 4 chapters explain the operation of artificial selection by man and of natural selection in consequence of the struggle for existence. The 5th chapter deals with the laws of variation and causes of modification other than natural selection. The 5 succeeding chapters consider difficulties in the way of a belief in evolution generally as well as in natural selection. The 3 remaining chapters, omitting the final recapitulation, deal with the evidence for evolution. The theory, which suggested a cause of evolution, is thus given the foremost place, and the evidence for the existence of evolution considered last. This evidence had never been thought out and marshaled in a manner which bears any comparison with that of Darwin, and the work would have been epoch-making had it consisted of the later chapters alone. A storm of controversy arose over the book, reaching its height at the British Association at Oxford in 1860, when the celebrated duel between T.H. Huxley and Bishop Wilberforce of Oxford took place. Throughout these struggles, Huxley was the foremost champion for evolution and for fair play to natural selection, although he never entirely accepted the latter theory, holding that until man by his selection had made his domestic breed sterile inter se, there was no sufficient evidence that selection accounts for natural species, which are thus separated by the barrier of sterility. The variation of animals and plants under domestication, probably the second in importance of Darwin's works, was published in 1868 and may be looked upon as a complete account of the material condensed in the first chapter of The Origin. He connected sets of observations under his provisional hypothesis of pangenesis, which assumes that every cell in the body, at every stage of growth and in maturity, is represented in each germ cell by a gemmule. The germ cell is only the meeting place of gemmules, and the true reproductive power lies in the whole of the body cells, which dispatch their representatives. Hence, pangenesis. There are reasons for believing that this infinitely complex conception, in which, as his letters show, he had great confidence, was forced upon Darwin in order to explain the hereditary transmission of acquired characters involved in the small proportion of Lamarckian doctrine which he incorporated. If such transmission does not occur, a simpler hypothesis based on the lines of Weismann's continuity of the germ plasm is sufficient to account for these facts. The Descent of Man and Selection in Relations to Sex, 1871, both fulfilled his statement in The Origin that light would be thrown on the origin of man and his history, and collected the evidence in support of his hypothesis of sexual selection, which he had briefly described in the 1858 essay. The Expression of the Emotions, 1872, offered a natural explanation of phenomena, which appeared to be a difficulty in the way of the acceptance of evolution. In 1876, Darwin brought out his two previously published geological works on volcanic islands in South America in a single volume. The widely read Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms appeared in 1881. And The Fertilization of Orchids in 1862, The Effects of Cross and Self-Fertilization in the Vegetable Kingdom, 1876, proved that the offspring of cross-fertilized individuals are more vigorous, as well as more numerous, than those produced by a self-fertilized parent. Different forms of flowers on plants of the same species, 1877, demonstrates that each different form, although possessing both kinds of sexual organs, is especially adapted to be fertilized by the pollen of another form, and that when artificially fertilized by pollen from a plant of its own form, less vigorous offspring are produced. Climbing plants and insectivorous plants were published in 1857, and The Power of Movement in Plants in 1880. Darwin died on April 19, 1882, and was buried in Westminster Abbey on the 26th. 2 daughters and 5 sons survived him, 4 of the latter becoming prominent in the scientific world. Sir George Howard, 1845 to 1912, who became professor of astronomy and experimental philosophy at Cambridge. Sir Francis, 1848 to 1925, distinguished botanist. Leonard, 1850 to 1943, a major in the Royal Engineers, and afterwards well known as an economist and eugenist. And Sir Horace, 1851 to 1928, civil engineer.